Hello and welcome to the Now Educated podcast. We just want to start off by thanking the team in Borodale, Cross Culture Borodale. Thank you so much for having us with you. We had a ball of a time, and thank you so much for everyone who's been throwing questions at us and asking us about the link to the Now Educated podcast. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for giving us your most important resource, and that's your time. And as we proceed today, I want to continue the conversation on something that someone asked me when we're having the talk on becoming. If you're in Harare, you want to make your way to Celebration Church, Cross Culture, they're doing a remarkable series on becoming, and it is out of this world. We just come off from finance, they did vision and purpose, and I can only imagine what is coming up this Saturday and the Saturdays to come. Just had to put it out there. It's a remarkable program. Shout out to Mr. C, shout out to Pamela, shout out to the A team. Man, you guys are doing amazing work. I digress. Let's go back. So one of the things that one of the people asked us in that meeting was around interest-bearing savings accounts or investments. And what quickly came into the conversation was the aspect of inflation. Now, if you're Zimbabwean, you pretty much know what inflation is, or if you don't know what it is, you've definitely felt it. You've lost value a couple of times. I got to see my parents lose the value of their savings, the value of their insurance policies, the value of their funeral cover plans. So literally, it caused devastation and continues to cause devastation in our nation of Zimbabwe. And very often creates so much fear because people lose so much that they begin to think that they can't do anything to grow wealth in Zim. So I want to start this conversation on inflation and give a bit of background, because I think sometimes we look at it and think it's very complicated, and the smart heads in the different offices make it seem like it's, you have to calculate it in complex ways and all these things, but I don't think it is. And I believe that our solution to inflation is not complex. It is very simple. It requires collective ingenuity and discipline amongst us as people. So let's talk about what inflation is and get back. In case you don't know what it is, maybe you're not Zimbabwean, you're Zimbabwean, but you've never really given it much thought. Now, inflation usually happens when a government or an agency mandated by the government to manage the money supply in the country prints too much money. And what that does is that it reduces the value of the money currently in circulation. So you see, you have too much money chasing too few goods. So what it does, it reduces the purchasing power or what your money can buy. And if the inflation is too high, like we've experienced in Zimbabwe in 2008, 2019, what most of us are going through right now, it gets to a point where that inflation begins to redistribute wealth from the poor to the wealthy, and in the process destroys the middle class, because usually the people who end up being poor or who are middle class tend to earn their income by waiting to get a salary from the employer. And unfortunately, as the value of money goes down, pay increases or salaries don't increase almost as fast. Like we have had inflations in Zimbabwe has gone to 500, 700, 1 billion%. So your salary is not catching up with the speed at which the money is losing value. So what ends up happening is you need to start taking out more money to buy those groceries. You need to take out more money to pay for fuel. You need to take out more money to pay for your medical bills. So what ends up happening is you having to take out more money and you have less goods than you had before. So you're getting poorer because of inflation. Now who's getting richer? The person who's getting richer is who you're giving money to, because they have more of that money coming to them and they're able, to some degree, to maintain the value of their wealth. So it is such a silent tax and probably the most painful of all taxes. But how do we get here? We get here when we say a government prints too much money, but how do we know a government has printed too much money? Who determines that a government has printed too much money? So all this comes down to us saying, is it really a government printing too much money? Or is inflation really a sign of bad leadership? A sign that the people who you've put in charge to do something clearly begin to distort. They do not understand what money is. And if you were at the meeting, you'd know that money is a certificate of performance. So that means that money, in its essence, or when we print those coins, it's to keep track of the economic transactions taking place in the economy, or rather to keep track of the good things people are doing for each other in exchange for these representations or these markers of wealth, right? That some of you call money. Now, if the markers become more than the value being created or the human creativity being exercised, we have a problem. And that's really what inflation is. It's truly a sign of bad leadership and of leaders stealing from their people intentionally because they failed or they refused to put discipline upon themselves. If you don't agree with me, let's talk about the British Empire. Let's take it back. If you know a bit about history, you'll know that the British Empire included all of Great Britain, South Africa, parts of Canada, Australia, and India. Huge empire. Now, the time of the British Empire, there were no computers, we didn't have Zimstats or these, complex statisticians with softwares and apps that believe that they can keep track of what transactions are going on and therefore print the right amount of money. We didn't have any of that. These guys used ships to get around. And the question now is, how did the Bank of England know exactly how much money to print? Because during the British Empire, if you go back in history, there's nearly 100 years where there is no such thing as inflation. There is no such thing as inflation for 100 years. And these guys didn't have this complex system, they didn't have softwares. So how did they keep track of how much money needed to be printed? How did they keep track of every transaction? Because if you listen to people today, they'll talk to you about inflation being, we're keeping track of all the transactions happening in an economy, and that's how we know, how money is flowing. Honestly, they didn't have the technology to know how many transactions were taking place. Now the question is, how did they avoid inflation? I'll tell you. They didn't tabulate it. All they did is understand the relationship of money. You see, when money was initially printed, it was printed because the currency at the time was gold. And because they realized gold was bulky and you couldn't break it down into smaller units, and with the advent of movement of people, improvements in transportation, that's ships coming along, trains, they thought that it would be a wise idea to have something that was more, easier to move around, right? Easier to exchange hands quicker. So what they did was they started printing money and they linked it to gold. So the money was linked to gold. So everyone knew that when I got this piece of paper, it was a representation of a certain quantity of gold. So it was easier to break down the value of transactions, and also money was less bulky, so you could move around with it without fear of being robbed or making it easily visible that you had money. But still, how did they overcome inflation? Because you could still overprint this and then mess up the relationship with gold. What they did was simple. They understood that every time people did good for each other, a transaction took place and money exchanged hands. So what they did in London, which was the center of the British Empire, was whenever anyone showed up, so the center of the British Empire, all the gold was sort of stored in the Bank of England. And you would go into the Bank of England, either deposit gold in exchange for paper money, or you'd go into the Bank of England with your gold, with your paper money, and they would give you back your gold. You get it? So, what the Bank of England would do, they didn't keep track of the transactions, they kept track of what happened in the banking hall. Whenever someone came into the banking hall with notes and submitted the notes, they would know that the number of transactions, the number of people doing good deeds for each other, or the number of transactions taking place had reduced. And that's why people wanted their gold back, because there wasn't much economic activity happening there. So immediately that would tell them it's time to stop printing notes. On the flip side, if people came with gold and deposited, that would tell them that the number of transactions happening, the number of people serving each other are increasing. And therefore, because the number of transactions, the number of good deeds happening in an economy or in the empire were increasing, they needed to print more money. So gold coming in, signal to them, okay, if we keep going, we're going to inflate, we're going to reduce the value of people's transactions and steal from them. If the amount of gold started coming in, they knew that, hey, more and more people are doing stuff for each other, so if we don't print enough money, we're going to create deflation. So we need to print more money so that transactions can continue flowing. That's how they got through nearly 100 years without any inflation. How did they do it? Human ingenuity and imposing discipline on themselves. They didn't allow the politics to dictate, they didn't allow elections to dictate how much money was printed. They said to themselves, if we want to grow this thing, and I believe this is what we need to start doing in this country. If you want to grow the country, stop complicating things with complex words. Put discipline upon yourselves. And understand that money is a certificate of performance. And it must only come into existence when people do stuff for each other, not when you feel like printing it. So I know that's a lot for today. Maybe when we come back next week on Tuesday, we'll talk about how if you live in a country where people are indisciplined and creates inflation, how can you begin to invest in a way that allows you to beat inflation and still build wealth in nations like ours? My name is Terrence, and I hope you're now educated. Till next week. Thank you so much for watching this and all the clips that we've been putting out there. We love the comments, we love the reactions, and we want to encourage you to do even more. Kindly go out, share this with your friends, share this with someone at work, share it with anyone you know will benefit from this. And most importantly, tell us what you want us to share with you in terms of stuff you want us to talk about or questions you'd like us to answer for you. Remember, the aim of this podcast is to help as many of us build better relationships with money. And we can only do that if we get this to as many people as possible. If you're as honest and as transparent as you can be, so that we answer the stuff that will move your world and help our world to become a better place. Remember, our community is all about getting to know better. And when you know better, we do better. But we want to go an extra step. We want to know better, help others know better. Because collectively, when we know better, we tend to do better. And like we always close, the world will get better. So thank you so much for watching this, and we hope that we can get more and more people to watch this, and we can build a community that ends up winners when it comes to this area of finances.